This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Greece has approved a plan to cut spending, raise taxes, and sell government-owned assets. The approval cleared the way for $17 billion in loans from the International Monetary Fund and the European Union. The loans are a share of the $156 billion rescue deal that Greece secured last year. The money will help the government to operate and pay its debts until the middle of September. But the austerity plan led to a 2-day general strike in Greece and violent demonstrations in Athens. Several hundred protesters and police were injured. Parliament approved the plan on June 29th and agreed to the details the next day. Prime Minister George Papandreou won more support than expected for his proposals. He appealed to Parliament to do everything possible to avoid defaulting on the debts of the birthplace of democracy. There is a choice, he said. We can remain a Greece which has a huge public sector, or change to a Greece which has an effective, democratic, and productive public sector. Greece is expected to seek more international help, even though years of government borrowing led to the crisis. Many protesters said their government is making decisions that only serve the interests of wealthy nations. But other Greeks see the need for austerity. One man said, "I think the policies are a good step towards finding common ground with the European Union. I don't think any country can operate in isolation these days, especially a country the size of Greece." On June 28th, the IMF chose French Finance Minister Christine Lagarde as its new managing director. Dominique Strauss-Kahn resigned in May after he was accused of sexually assaulting a hotel cleaning woman in New York. But on July 1st, a judge released Mr. Strauss-Kahn from house arrest as the investigation continued. Prosecutors raised questions about the believability of the accuser. The IMF has always been led by a European, but Ms. Lagarde is the first woman. She received support from the United States and European nations, as well as Russia, Brazil, and China. She has promised to be a strong voice for developing countries, especially in Asia and Africa. But international monetary expert Domenico Lombardi says she can also pressure other European finance ministers to take a more aggressive stance on the European crisis. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. Continuing debt problems in Greece and Portugal. The banking crisis in Ireland. $1 trillion deficit in the United States. These are all reasons why high levels of public debt are a big worry around the world. Countries that keep spending a lot more than they earn may not be able to repay their debts. That risk of default can make it harder and costlier for them to borrow more money. Heavy debt can also affect a country's competitiveness. Voter anger at government spending and taxes helped lead to the big Republican gains in America's congressional elections in November. President Obama says for the economy to improve, the government must cut spending and reduce its deficit. In February, he formed the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. The two chairmen are Erskine Bowles, a Democrat, and Alan Simpson, a Republican. In November, the chairmen presented their own ideas for how to cut the federal deficit to about 2% of the economy by 2015. The administration estimates this year's deficit at about 10.5%. The two chairmen say their proposals would cut the deficit by almost $4 trillion over the next 10 years. $100 billion would come from the military. Other proposals would cut the federal workforce by 10% and freeze civilian pay. The chairman proposed to simplify the tax laws and reduce tax rates, but they also proposed to cut some popular tax breaks. One target is deductions for interest paid on home mortgage loans over $500,000. Another proposal would add 2 years to the full retirement age for Social Security, raising it to 69 by about 2075. The commission includes current and former lawmakers from both parties. Other groups are offering their own debt reduction plans. Former Senator Pete Domenici and former Clinton administration official Alice Rivlin led a task force that presented its plan. That plan aims to save $6 trillion over 10 years. It would freeze federal spending for several years, change the tax laws, and create a national sales tax. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can download all of our programs, including transcripts, at voaspecialenglish.com. And we're on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at VOA Learning English. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. German health officials announced on June 10th that bean sprouts were the cause of Europe's deadly outbreak of E. coli bacteria. E. coli infections killed at least 30 people since late May. 3,000 others were sickened. Most of the victims were in Germany. After the announcement, Russia said it will lift its ban on European Union vegetables in return for EU safety guarantees. At first, German officials suggested that cucumbers from Spain were to blame. Russia and other countries quickly banned vegetable imports from Spain and other European countries. The Spanish Agriculture Minister, Rosa Aguilar, demanded that Germany pay for her country's losses. John Dalli of Malta is the European Union's Commissioner for Health and Consumer Policy. He said a rush to judgment spreads unjustified fears in the population all over Europe and creates problems for our food producers selling products in the EU and outside of the EU. Some critics accused Russia of using the issue to try to help its effort to join the World Trade Organization. Russia is the largest economy without membership in the WTO. EU Farm Commissioner Dacian Ciolos proposed giving European farmers $220 million in aid. The goal was to help European farmers recover at least 50% of their losses. By June 8th, Mr. Ciolos had raised the amount to over $300 million. The E. coli outbreak was not the only issue troubling Europe. European governments and the International Monetary Fund were considering as much as $65 billion in new loans to Greece. Some officials admitted that earlier rescue loans were not enough. Thousands of government workers protested spending cuts approved by the Greek cabinet to reduce budget deficits. Separately, French Finance Minister Christine Lagarde continued her campaign to become the next head of the IMF. She visited China after traveling to India. Mexican Central Bank Chief Agustin Carstens was seeking to become the first non-European to lead the international lender. Dominique Strauss-Kahn resigned as IMF managing director because of charges of attempted rape of a hotel maid in New York. He pleaded not guilty during a court appearance on June 6th. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can learn American English and much more every day at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. More people are able to receive higher education worldwide than in the past. But the amount of higher education is causing social and economic divisions in many countries. A recent study by the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, or OECD, also finds that some developing countries are making progress. 5 years ago, the world financial crisis hurt many nations, but it did not slow growth in education. The OECD report notes the quality and amount of education is increasing the division between what it calls the haves and the have-nots. In some areas, rising unemployment has affected people with lower education levels more than others. They earn considerably less than those with higher degrees. There are 34 economically developed countries in the OECD. Among those countries, the unemployment rate for people with a university education is about 5%. However, the rate is almost 20% for 25 to 34-year-olds who do not have a university degree. This situation also exists in developing economies. Andreas Schleicher is the Education and Skills Director for the OECD. He says education makes more of a difference in the life chances of people than in the past. The report finds that education makes a greater difference for individuals within countries. But it also notes that education is reducing divisions between developed and developing countries. Mr. Schleicher says countries like China, Vietnam, and Brazil are making education an important goal. He says they are investing their limited resources to get good teachers and school leaders. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. The United States has a new health care reform law. The main goal is to insure about 32 million additional people. That is about 95% of Americans who are not already covered by Medicare, the government insurance program for older people. About 16 million people will be added to Medicaid, the government health plan for the poor. The law will require Americans to have health insurance, with a few exceptions, or pay a fine starting in 4 years. Also in 4 years, employers with more than 50 workers will have to offer their employees a health insurance plan. Employers will pay a fine for each uninsured worker. Smaller businesses will receive tax credits to help pay for health plans. People not covered by employer plans, Medicaid or Medicare, could buy health insurance in marketplaces called exchanges. The idea is that competition among plans will drive down costs. States will provide these exchanges by 2014. The law is the biggest change in American health care since 1965. But it is not a government-operated health care system like the ones in other countries. President Obama said it provides limited reform. He said, "This is not radical reform, but it is major reform." This legislation will not fix everything that ails our health care system, but it moves us decisively in the right direction. Barry Arbuckle is chief executive of the nonprofit Memorial Care Health System in Fountain Valley, California. He says the new law gets the issue of health reform moving. But he notes it is mainly health insurance reform. He says lawmakers will have to reform the way health care is provided. That means finding ways for hospitals, doctors, and other providers to work together more effectively. Mr. Arbuckle also would like to see more attention on prevention, so fewer people need costly medical treatment. The law is expected to cost about $940 billion over 10 years. However, the Obama administration says the plan will cut the nation's budget deficit by more than $100 billion during that period. Last year, the United States spent $2.5 trillion on health care. This was an increase of almost 6% from the year before. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report. You can comment on our reports at our website, voaspecialenglish.com.
I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. The season for buying Christmas gifts was the busiest time for most stores and online retailers in the United States. Final numbers for the holiday season, including after Christmas sales, will not be known for a while. But a report on retail sales in November suggested that economic growth may be gaining speed. The Commerce Department said sales increased for the 5th month in a row. They grew by 0.8% over October. But the report came the same day the central bank said the economy is not growing fast enough to reduce unemployment. The jobless rate is nearly 10%. So, policymakers at the Federal Reserve voted to continue a program of buying government bonds. That program, launched in November, could inject $600 billion into the economy. The aim is to increase economic growth by lowering long-term interest rates. That would reduce borrowing costs for businesses and individuals. But long-term rates have risen since the Fed launched its latest program of so-called quantitative easing, known as QE2. One way to get a sense of how Americans feel about the economy is through retail sales. Consumer demand drives about 70% of the nation's economic activity. The National Retail Federation says its members employ 25 million people in the retail and services industry. Those businesses reported almost $2.5 trillion in sales in 2009. Terry Lundgren is chief executive of Macy's, the company that owns Macy's and Bloomingdale's department stores. He said retail and restaurants represent 1 in 5 jobs in America. So if we do well, then we're going to be the ones that will start to lead us into a recovery. The kinds of stores where sales are up also says something about the economy. Stores with the lowest prices do well in hard economic times. But the Retail Federation said at the end of November that discounters had fewer shoppers this year. Stores that sell jewelry and other higher-priced items have seen sales grow. Another change: Americans are less willing to buy on credit. Over 40% of holiday shoppers said they planned to mainly use debit cards instead of credit cards. Instead of borrowing money, debit cards take money directly from a bank account. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Small business entrepreneurs play an important part in American job growth. Small businesses have created almost 2/3 of new jobs in the last 15 years. The economy has traditionally been divided into 3 sectors. One is the private sector, meaning businesses. The second is the public sector, or government. And the third is the nonprofit sector. But now some people talk about a 4th sector. It represents nonprofit and for-profit organizations working toward goals of social change and environmental activism. Universities are starting to offer training and degree programs to prepare students to work in this area. One of these schools is Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. It now offers a degree in social entrepreneurship. Bernard Turner is director of the Center for Social Entrepreneurship at the university. He says student interest is driving many of these new programs. Students are saying, "Now I want to be an entrepreneur, but I want to do something that deals with a social problem or a social issue that's dear to me." William Paddock is founder and director of a business consulting company in Tennessee called WAP Sustainability. He has a business degree and training in the area of environmental sustainability. Recently, the custom packaging company of Lebanon, Tennessee, hired him to help make its business more environmentally friendly. The company makes cardboard advertising displays for sales campaigns. Mr. Paddock advised the company on recycling and ways to create less waste. He also persuaded the business to use electricity from solar energy. William Paddock offers his consulting services for profit, but says social responsibility is a big part of what his company does. For us, it's about protecting the environment, being better to society, but also there's an economic piece to it. We love to find our passions, but also save somebody money. There are now more than 60 American universities offering so-called green business degrees. The definition of social entrepreneurship and the exact nature of this sector continue to evolve. Some people are more interested in social programs and charity. Others are more interested in business plans and profits. But the root of the movement seems to be a desire to earn a living and make a difference at the same time. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can watch a video report on social entrepreneurship at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. The American housing market is growing stronger. Yet, many areas are still suffering from the collapse of the market in 2008. Richmond is a small city in California. More than half of the homeowners there owe more for their home loans than the properties are currently worth. Such loans are risky for lenders since people in that situation often stop making payments. Now, city officials are moving forward with a plan to rescue these struggling homeowners. The city wants to buy the mortgages from banks for an amount equal to the current value of the properties. It plans to work with an investment company to help each homeowner get a new mortgage through government programs and private investors. City officials say if banks do not cooperate, they will force the lenders to sell the loans. Richmond plans to use the legal power called eminent domain. This allows officials to take a property, but requires the government to pay fair market value. State and local governments use this legal power to take property needed for public purposes, such as new roads, schools, or economic development. At least 2 banks are asking a federal court to intervene. They want the court to prevent the city of Richmond from using eminent domain. Lawyers for the banks say investors such as retirees would lose money. They also say the action would interfere with their contracts with investors. The United States paid billions of dollars to rescue banks during the world financial crisis. Now, the courts must decide if Richmond, California, can help rescue homeowners through the power of eminent domain. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.